ביחד עם הקהל. השורש שירה לכבוד התורה, השורש שירה לכבוד התורה. איי לה 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 לה. איי מתמזגה זרקה ובאה, זרקה ובאה. קהל, השורש שירה לכבוד התורה, השורש שירה Ay Moshe Rabbeinu, אימה, עין מאירה, השורש, שורש שירה, לכבוד התורה, השורש שירה, לכבוד התורה, מפז לקרא, זכה וברה, זכה וברה, מפז לקרא, זכה וברה, זכה וברה, השורש שירה, לכבוד התורה, השורש שירה, לכבוד התורה, מפז לקרא, זכה וברה, זכה וברה, מפז לקרא, זכה וברה. זכה וברא ושנה טובה לכולם.
Chag Sameach, everyone. Welcome to our program for Erev Shavuot. We hope you are starting the week with renewed vigor and energy, knowing that we are going right basically from a restful Shabbat into a Chag, a festival, with a little bit of time in between. We have a number of wonderful things planned for you, and I'm going to just turn it over to Rabbi to tell us about our program this evening. Rabbi?
Great. Hi, everyone. Erev Tov, Chag Sameach. Wonderful to be with you. We're going to sing a few songs to get us started, and then we're going to have some wonderful teaching and conversation with Professor Dr. Tammy Schneider, and after that we'll have a little bit of a interlude, a musical transition, and then some more opportunities to learn with Professor Dr. Gary Gilbert, and then we have toward the end, I hope to kind of reflect back with all of you on what is it for us to be in this time of Matan Toratenu, the giving of our Torah. What does it mean for us to be, in a sense, part of Revelation, standing at Mount Sinai at this time, and talk about a few possible ways for us to think about that as we move forward. So great to be with all of you, and I'm going to turn it back over to Cantor Paul for a little music to bring us in.
Thank you so much, Rabbi. So in case you were with us, in the 10 minutes or so preceding Rabbi and I coming on air, that was an incredible video of Rabbi Chaim Luke, one of the most profound expositors of the Nusach, the musical contributions of the Moroccan Jewish community. Started off with Yismach Moshe, and then a love song to the Torah, as it's called in the YouTube channel. So I thought that would be an appropriate way to start off this evening, as is a little bit of Akdamut Nusach. Akdamut is a piyut that is part of the core liturgy of the traditional Shavuot morning service, and just going to use a little bit of the melody and words that are familiar, I think, at least to start off. הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד. How good and how beautiful it is for all of us to dwell together as one. Hag Shavuot, Hag Shavuot, Hag Shavuot, hine ze ba. Hag Shavuot, Hag Shavuot, Hag Shavuot, hine ze ba. Al roshenu ze prachim, beyadenu bekurim. Al roshenu ze prachim, beyadenu bekurim. Hag Shavuot, Hag Shavuot, Hag Shavuot, hine ze ba. Hag Shavuot, Hag Shavuot, Hag Shavuot, hine ze ba. Eitz Chaim hi lemachazikima betomcheha me'ushar. Eitz Chaim hi lemachazikima betomcheha me'ushar. Shalom, 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 shalom. It is a tree of life to those who are fast to it. All of its supporters are happy. It is a tree of life to those who are fast to it. All who embrace it are happy. Shalom, 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 shalom.
All right. Thank you so much. So we're going to move in just a moment to our first presentation. Just a little framing. I think we all have the frame, but just in case to share a little bit as we've been counting the Omer each night, starting with the second night of Pesach. And last night, I should say some of us have sometimes been counting the Omer, but last night we did at our Zoom Havdalah, we had our final night of counting as we counted the day 49, which was 7 weeks in the counting of the Omer. So we have this period of 7 and 7 and 7, which is sort of this 7 is this number of perfection and of wholeness that plays out. And in many ways, it is also a journey that we move from freedom to commitment, right? From leaving the servitude of Pharaoh and coming to the servitude of God, right? Serving a different master, in a sense, as we move forward. And so as we come to Shavuot, we stand at that mountain again, and we'll talk a little bit about, after we hear from Tammy and Gary, perhaps what that means to us, and what some of the different images of what it might mean to be at that mountain on Shavuot, what that might be. But we're going to look at that a little bit. So tonight we are now at the mountain, 50 days after leaving Egypt. And there are lots of traditions for Shavuot. In many places, people study all night long. I've only done that a few times in my life, and I was younger then. And it was easier to stay up, and I could sleep the next day, like I get up and I go to sleep the next day after services. But That's called a TIKKUN LEIL Shavuot, and often people study a little bit from lots of different holy books as it goes through, a way to kind of cover Jewish tradition as we go through. So that's sort of our frame, and I think we're going to move in a minute. I think Cantor Paul may be grabbing some festival candles so that we can light them together for people who haven't had the chance to do that. I had mine are burning on the other side of the door here. All right, just carrying them there. Yes, all right. So now he just has to find that lighter and see if it works tonight, because it didn't work the other night when we were lighting candles during our service. It didn't want to light. All right. So for those who haven't yet had the opportunity, we'll light the candles Shel Yom Tov as we move into this Shavuot.
Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu. Oops, wrong blessing. Sorry. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu lehadlik ner shel Yom Tov.
All right, thank you. And I believe Dr. Schneider is going first this evening. Is that correct? Yes. Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Tammy.
You said I was. Can you make me co-host so I can share my screen?
Sure. Paul's going to have to do that. Cantor, will you do that?
I did it already, Tammy.
Oh, I already am.
Should be fine.
Great. Okay. Great. Shalom to everybody. So there we go. Whoops. Nope, that's not where I want to be though. Hold on a second. Hold on a second. Why did it? Let's just have it go from the beginning. No. Okay, ignore what you're seeing. You haven't seen any of these beautiful pictures. Okay. All right, there we go. I am one of those who has also stayed up all night studying on Shavuot, and I actually have done it fairly recently, and I love it. I'm somebody who actually didn't pull all-nighters, and so to do it for this was great joy. So I went down a bunch of rabbit holes because having studied and led the study group that studied all night, I was just going to briefly summarize that for everybody. And then when I started investigating it a little bit, all sorts of weird things emerged, as is often the case when one does a deep dive into things that we all know and is just sort of checking on the things. So today I'm going to talk about the law of Moses, and my specialty is Hebrew Bible. So for me, everything starts in the Bible. And of course, one of the things that amazes me about Judaism is usually the biblical text is often a mirage for actual things that we do. And so this is sort of my moving around through that. So I hope you find it as interesting as I did discovering it all. So we're going to look at this holiday, where, when, and what is Jewish law, ending with how do we as Reformed Jews deal with that? And I actually read the Pittsburgh planks, so to prepare. So tonight I'm going to discuss why we're studying on Shavuot and go over where in the Bible we talk about this particular holiday, and then look at how it gets connected with the law, and then review the traditional readings, review the mitzvot, and end with what do we do with these mitzvot as modern liberal Jews. So as the rabbi just talked a little bit about, TIKKUN LEIL Shabbat is this tradition where we study all night long on Shavuot. Why do we do this was sort of my first rabbit hole. And there's this line in the Zohar, right, which is a Kabbalistic book. And I saw, I think Professor Magaha is here, and so I'm a little hesitant to say too much about it and get in trouble and get it all wrong. But there's a sort of a reference in the Zohar to it. And then there is a midrash that suggests that the night before we were supposed to appear, right, we're prepping for 3 days to get the law, and then the night before we were supposed to get there, we overslept. So there's sort of two ways it goes. I saw one is that we have to study all night long to correct the mishap that we almost missed receiving the Torah because our alarm clocks didn't go off. And the other is to make sure that it doesn't happen again. We have to study leading up to receiving Torah. And I thought that this was a really old tradition, but it turns out that it dates to 1533 during the Ottoman Empire. And this Rabbi Joseph Caro, who he had a party and they prepared for 3 days and they pulled an all-nighter. And during that, an angel appeared and taught them Jewish law. So we'll see, you can judge how Gary and I do tonight. What was really fascinating about this is that this coincides with the with coffee being a thing in Turkey, right? So the proliferation of coffee is actually a 16th century phenomena. And so apparently prior to that, the thought of staying up all night wasn't really as in as it is now that we have coffee to sustain us. And just as an ironic little twist, in the little library on my street, there was a book about the Jews of Amsterdam and coffee, which I read. It wasn't a very good book. And it turns out that, of course, Jane is the person who put it in there in the first place. So again, the neighborhood continues. All right, so where do we hear about Shavuot in the Hebrew Bible? In Exodus 34:22, we are told to observe the Feast of Weeks, which this is, and the first fruits of the wheat harvest and the ingathering at the turn of the year. So again, it's an agricultural festival, and that's reiterated in Exodus 23:16 as well. And then in Numbers 28:26, again, our first fruits, we're not supposed to work. And then again, we hear of that in Deuteronomy 16:10. And notice that all of those, Shavuot is just not just, but is an agricultural festival. So it is connected to wheat, and this is a happy time that we learn about in Jeremiah and Deuteronomy and Isaiah. The harvesting of barley starts apparently during Passover and ended in the with wheat at Shavuot. Okay. So, the Talmud, right? So there's still no combination between receiving the law and this agricultural festival. The Talmud refers to Shavuot as the Atzeret, which is refraining or holding back, right? Which seems to be talking about the prohibition against work. This concludes the Passover season, right? We're done counting the Omer. I've run out of Omer to count personally. And then since Shavuot occurs 50 days after Passover, Hellenistic Jews named the holiday Pentecost, right? The 50th day. And then of course, Christians took Pentecost as a movable feast and assigns to it as the Easter, the 50th day from Easter Sunday, and commemorates the descent of the Holy Spirit. So we don't usually refer to it as Pentecost, even though it was originally a Hellenistic Jewish term. All right, so how do we connect Shavuot to the law at Sinai? The earliest Talmudic statement on the date of it appears to be in Tractate Shabbat, which says, according to the calculations of the sages, the Jews left Egypt on Friday, the 15th of Nisan, and the Torah was given on Saturday, the 6th of Sivan, which was the equivalent of the 50th day of the Omer, the day on which Shavuot was permanently fixed in scripture. But of course, you can't have rabbis agreeing with each other. And so Rabbi Jose, a 2nd century rabbi, offered a dissenting view saying that we left on Thursday. And so Saturday, the 7th of Sivan, we got the Torah, right? I mean, check your plane tickets. So the ecclesiastic calendar of the Book of Jubilees corroborates Rabbi Jose's date. So we can't, the rabbis can't even agree on exactly when, where, and how all of this lays out. So what are the traditional readings for Shavuot? So somehow it gets connected through this timing. So what are the traditional readings for Shavuot? The Book of Ruth, the Exodus 19, 1 through 20, Deuteronomy, Ezekiel, Habakkuk, Sefer Yetzirah, Psalms 1, 19, 68, 119, and 150, excerpts from the Mishnayot and the beginning and end of each of the 63 tractates, and some are read in full. The 613 commandments as enumerated by Maimonides in the beginning and end of every Torah portion, and some of them in full. So again, there's plenty to keep us busy all night long on Shavuot, right? It's hard to get through all that stuff. All right, so why Dafka those texts? So the Book of Ruth takes place during the wheat harvest, and Ruth is the ancestress of David, and David's birth date and death date are supposed to be Shavuot. I think this is circular reasoning by the rabbis, but who am I to argue with them? And so we read the Book of Ruth on Shavuot. The Exodus passage is one where there's thunder and lightning on Mount Sinai. The Deuteronomy passage contains the laws for the 3 pilgrimage festivals. Shavuot is one of them. Ezekiel is an ecstatic vision of the divine chariot, which is what we're looking at right now. Habakkuk is another vision of the deity marching with divine hosts. So both of them kind of, the earth is shaking and all of this mystical kind of stuff. And the Psalms that we read are those that about teaching and Torah and mountains. So they all are kind of Shavuot getting the law-esque. All right, so in summary, Shavuot is a wheat harvest, right? It's an agricultural festival to which the revelation at Sinai was later attached, right? So we've connected those things. And again, agricultural festivals are hard to move around. And especially for those of us in the Galut who don't celebrate that yearly kind of thing, having something else, especially if we're living in places where our climates don't align with those of Israel, it helps to have sort of an intellectual connection. All right, so what is this law, right, that we're talking about, right? There's Torah, which is what we hear about receiving on this evening or on this day, if we stay up all night and don't miss it. The laws instituted by the rabbis, which to some extent are oral law. And then the longstanding tradition or custom, right? Tradition is not just a song on Fiddler on the Roof, but it's something that actually matters a lot to us as Jews. All right, so as always, there's problem with the terminology. So the word mitzvah is also commonly used in a casual way, like, it's such a mitzvah, right? To any good deed, right? And so because of this, the you know, when you're having sophisticated discussions about this, which I don't do very often, but others do. So a mitzvah d'oraita is something that's from Torah, and a mitzvah d'Rabbanan is from the rabbi, right? And they're both Aramaic phrases because that's what they are. And then a mitzvah that arises from custom is a minhag, right? So there's different kinds of law that we, do we think about them differently? Do they carry different weight? You decide, right? Because we'll get to that. So all three of these sources are supposed to be binding, but there are differences in the way that we receive them. All right. So where did we get the 613, right? Like how did that get counted that way? All right. So the notion that there are 613 mitzvot or commandments in the Torah is first recorded in the 3rd century CE, where it's mentioned in a sermon in the Talmud Makot 23b, right? Which again, 3rd century is kind of late. If you think about Jewish history, you know, for me, anything after 586 BCE is modern history. So the 3rd century is already like, you know. Okay, so the breakdown of the 613, there are 248 positive commandments, right? These are things that you are to do, right? And this is supposedly connected to the number of bones and organs in the human body. No doctor, I'm not that kind of a doctor. I'm not that kind of, I'm not a physician, so I don't know how close that is or not. And then there are 365 negative commandments to abstain from certain acts, right? Things that you are not to do. And this coincides with the number of days in the solar year, which is, we're looking at the sun here. The irony, of course, is that Judaism is based on a solar calendar. So it's ironic that they would connect the number to, Judaism runs on a lunar calendar. So it's ironic that it would be connected to a solar. All right, so don't panic. You don't actually have 613 to do anymore. So there are only 77 positive and 140 negative commandments that can be observed today, because after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, there's a bunch that we can no longer practice. And then there are 26 commandments that can only be done inside the land of Israel. So those of us in the Golah are down to a mere 245, just in case you were wondering. Okay, so why 613, right? Those are sort of big general numbers that they were throwing out, you know, party parts, etc. So according to the Talmud in Deuteronomy 33:4, when it says that Moses commanded us the Torah as an inheritance for the community of Jacob, means that Moses transmitted the Torah from the deity to the Israelites. And the Talmud notes that the Hebrew numerical value of the word Torah, right, if you're going to play gematria, is 611. So if you combine Moses' 611 commandments with the first two, could have the 10 commandments, which are the only ones heard directly from the deity, that's how we get 613. Okay, so the Talmud attributes that number to a Rabbi SINAI, but other sages who hold this view include Rabbi Shimon ben Azai and Rabbi Eliezer ben Yosef the Galilean. Okay, and this number is quoted in Midrash and all of these places. But of course, because we're Jewish, there's always dissenting opinions, including Abraham and Ezra, Nachmanides, and even the Vilna Gaon. All right, so so what counts as a commandment, right? And this is actually difficult to figure out. There are problems when trying to figure out how do we come up with this 613 magical number. So which statements are to be included among the 613? Is every one of the deity's commands to any individual or to the entire people of Israel, right? All of these problems go into what counts even as a commandment or a mitzvah that we should observe. So there is no one single definitive list that explicates the 613 commandments. And for me, this was kind of mind-blowing because we use this 613 number as some Holy Writ from Sinai, right? Dafka today. And many of the lists differ. And of course, because we're Jewish, we all interpret the passages differently, which is a blessing also. And other commandments in the Torah fall into these other funny categories, right? So in 1878, our friend Rabbi Adolf, who is also known as Aharon Jelinek, published a pamphlet, right, where he counted those who counted the mitzvot, right? And almost immediately somebody pointed out a whole bunch of problems with that, right? So we can't even agree on how many disagreements we have. The pseudo-winner is almost always Maimonides. Maimonides tackled the idea of the 613 mitzvot in new ways in his book of the commandments. And I was emailing back and forth with Gary yesterday as I was going down these various rabbit holes. Gary said, well, of course, it always ends in Maimonides. And as my dear colleague, Mr. Gilbert, Professor Gilbert, often also points out, is this wasn't even his day job, right? All of this amazing, brilliant work that he did, that wasn't even his day job. His day job was a doctor, like the physician kind. Okay, so, but what Maimonides did is he came up with methodological principles, right? And so he didn't just randomly sort of, pull out things. And as a result of that, he sort of critiqued his predecessors, which, that's what scholars do. All right, so his book of commandments addresses questions of scriptural and extra scriptural sources, right? So Maimonides actually, cared about his bibliography, as it were. And so he looked at the sources of the law. Can you still hear me? Because, okay. So he had very careful ways of categorizing what he was doing. And it seems that he was trying to create almost a new genre, right? And he was less interested in counting these laws for liturgical purposes and or their roots or philosophical applications, but he was actually interested in, like, what do we do with this, right? So there are a number of websites, because I don't want to take up all evening, that actually lists what the commandment is, and they're categorized as Maimonides did, and then there are a few that have other categorizations. And then it lists the scriptural reference, right? So how we get to that. So I'm not going to go over all of them, but one year, a group of mine that I meet with in Orange County, we stayed up all night and we actually read them all out loud, which was great fun. So what is the Reform movement's take on these 613 commandments, right? So we're celebrating receiving the law today. So what do we as Reform Jews think about this? And this is not from the Reform movement's site. This is actually from a Jewish virtual library. But they argue that Reform Judaism differs from the other major movements in that it views both the oral and written laws as a product of human hands. Specifically, it views the Torah as divinely inspired, but written in the language of the time in which it was given. The laws reflect their times, but contain many timeless truths. The Reform movement stresses retention of the key principles of Judaism. As for practice, it strongly recommends individual study of the traditional practices. However, the adherent is free to follow only those practices that increases the sanctity of their relationship to the deity. Reform Judaism also stresses equality between the sexes. So again, and I was taught this as a kid, so I was happy to see this, is that we as Reform Jews we have to study it, and then we decide whether it is relevant for us. And so again, the study part for me is key here. And then finally, there was this Pittsburgh platform in 1885 that I actually then went and read. And there are three planks of it that I think address this sort of head on. We recognize in the Bible the record of the consecration of the Jewish people to its mission as the priest of the one God, and value it as the most potent instrument of religious and moral instruction. We hold that the modern discoveries of scientific researches in the domain of nature and history are not antagonistic to the doctrine of Judaism, the Bible reflecting the primitive ideas of its own age, and at times clothing its conception of divine providence and justice dealing with men in miraculous narratives. We recognize in the Mosaic legislation a system of training the Jewish people for its mission during its national life in Palestine, and today we accept as binding only its moral laws and maintain only such ceremonies as elevate and sanctify our lives, but reject all such as are not adapted to the views and habits of modern civilization. We hold that all such Mosaic and rabbinical laws as regulate diet, priestly purity, and dress originated in ages and under the influence of ideas entirely foreign to our present mental and spiritual state. They fail to impress the modern Jew with the spirit of priestly holiness. Their observance in our days is apt rather to obstruction than to further modern spiritual elevation. So I am going to stop sharing my screen. I was kind of thrilled to find the Pittsburgh planks. I think I had learned about them once upon a time, and they were pretty interesting. And so I don't know what time we're supposed to end, and therefore how much time I have, and if there is time for conversation or not. So I turn to the rabbi.
We have some time for conversation, so let's do that.
Okay.
I mean, if there's conversation to be had, we should have it.
Questions, comments. You know, one of the things that I didn't think I was going to lead us towards the reading some of the laws and having a conversation about how we felt about it. And when I went deep down into this, I was amazed at how the 600, you know, how Shavuot is actually an agricultural festival and not linked to law. That is a much later thing. And that this notion of where the laws are and how they come to and where we come up with it and all of that is also super late and almost made up, right? Like they came up with this number and then, you know, filled it, you know, backfilled it. And so, and something I often grapple with is the study and then reject, right? And so where do I, as a modern Jew, what criteria do I always use, and am I consistent? And so when I saw how inconsistent the development of the laws was, I have to say it felt a little better rejecting some of them than I had previously felt, which feels terrible to say on Shavuos in front of the rabbi, but you know, all of a sudden, the Pittsburgh planks, right, which are more than 100 years old, actually seemed really pretty solid. So I don't know, did I just say a bad thing, Rabbi?
No, although one of the interesting things is that the Pittsburgh platform was considered the platform of classical Reform Judaism, and that the CCAR went back to Pittsburgh in 1999, right? And
I couldn't find them though. And
passed a new platform in 1999 that represented, right, a different time. So this is the Torah section right here.
Okay.
Right. And part of what's interesting about it, and we're not going to read the whole Torah section here, but is that this one particular paragraph that I'm pointing to, it says, okay, we are committed to the ongoing study of the whole array of mitzvot and to the fulfillment of those that address us as individuals and a community. Some of these mitzvot, sacred obligations, have long been observed by Reform Jews. Others, both ancient and modern, demand renewed attention as the result of the unique context of our own times, right? And they go on and talk about much more specifically, but whereas in Pittsburgh, they're sure that the only thing that really, the first time in Pittsburgh,
Right.
right? They're sure that the only thing that really matters is those ethical mitzvot that call to us, right? Those kinds of things. 1999, we're in a very different place, right? In which none of the traditional mitzvot should be off limits if they bring meaning to our lives and fit the context of our times, right? So obviously for Reform Jews, things that went against egalitarianism or other kinds of things like that would have to have strict scrutiny, so to speak, right? In that sense, because that's a core value, or, you know, other kinds of inclusivity issues and those kinds of stuff. But so I just think that's an interesting piece. We're still very much shaped by, you know, Pittsburgh 1800s, but we also are, you know, we both embrace it and reject it, right? It's sort of like the tension that plays out in that time.
Which is exactly our relationship with the 613 and some of the things, right? It's that constant, what do we have room for? What do we not have room for? And what I thought so compelling was this notion that, that even within, even with, Orthodox Judaism is prepared to tell us that the 613 are clearly set, et cetera, right? And that this is what we have. And yet that's not true either, right? And it's so clear that what the 613 are, and if there are 600, is this evolving process that every generation goes through. And even Maimonides is like, no, they were wrong. I'm going to figure this out. And even come up with a classification system that's different, right? So again, Reform Judaism fits beautifully in that trajectory that we are celebrating today.
One of the things I always think is interesting is that certain things get set, right? So clearly by early on in that period, 613 was picked as the number, right? And then we end up with different lists as to what those 613 are, but we all agree it has to be 613, right? That number is fixed, right? It can be reapportioned in a sense, in a new way, but you're stuck with 613, right? And so I just think that's sort of an interesting thing, and how often with ritual and stuff like that, sometimes the custom or the ritual is really well established. We do this. The reason we do it changes over time, right? We have to reinterpret it to have it make sense if we're going to keep doing it, right? Because the initial reason, we may not even know what the initial reason was, right? That we do these things, but we have an eisegetical interpretive system in which we read back into it with our own stuff.
Well, and that was what was so amazing to me about that 613 number, is like somebody came up with it. It's not even, well rooted in any text, right? And then suddenly everyone is spending all this time backfilling it. But Mikey, did you have a?
Yes, I did.
Yep.
Because I think that we're concentrating too much on Reform Judaism being flexible. I think the fact that you have so many interpretations over such a long period of time, I mean, Judaism was born yesterday, relatively speaking, is because we've always been interpreters and we've always been adapters. So it's not just a reform kind of thing.
Well, I would agree with you 100%. I mean, the beauty of, and I constantly am amazed at how within the, how almost Orthodox Reform Judaism is insofar as, everything keeps changing, right? And this notion of, even, right, the Hasidic movement, right? That was originally started,
as a rebellion.
Right. And so again, everything you know, that starts as a rebellion, if it lasts, then becomes tradition, right? You know, that's just the nature of the beast, right?
Right. Other comments or questions for Tammy?
I'm sorry, Paul, this isn't exactly what you wanted, but it kind of got close.
He may be talking to you, but
anything you do is exactly what needs to be done, Tammy.
All right. All right, Paul, you want to transition us?
I do. So we talk about adaptation and, you know, revolution and how things change with the times. I just want to share a brief, just adjust my camera here a little bit, a brief video of my colleague Simon Spiro from Toronto, who for many, many, many years served a traditional conservative community, but he was always presented himself as a bit of an iconoclast, a bit of a rebel. So I'm going to share with you his current congregation, which he started along with his wife, his partner, called Song Shul in Toronto. If you're ever up in Toronto, you can check out Song Shul, and this is how they introduce their Torah service.
Torah, Torah, Torah tziva lanu, Torah, Torah tziva lanu, lanu Moshe, Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Torah, 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 Torah tziva lanu, lanu, Torah, Torah tziva lanu, lanu Moshe, Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Torah, 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 Tziva, Lanu Moshe, Torah, Tziva, Lanu Moshe, Torah, Tziva, Lanu Moshe, Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Torah, 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 Tziva, Lanu Moshe, Torah, Tziva, Lanu Moshe, Torah, Tziva, Lanu Moshe, Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Torah, 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 Tziva lanu, lanu, Torah, Torah, Tziva lanu, lanu Moshe, Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Torah, 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 Tziva lanu, lanu, Torah, Torah, Tziva lanu, lanu Moshe, Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Morasha Kehilat Yaakov, Morasha Kehilat Yaakov. Torah.
Little taste of Song Shul out of Toronto, Canada. Rabbi?
That's great.
Gary Gilbert, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, so let me get my presentation up here. Very good. So I hope you can see that. So, you know, over the years, I've probably learned only 2 or 3 really important things in my life. And one of those things is never follow Tammy Schneider. Because you just can't do it. You know, she just lays it all out there, and trying to follow in the footsteps of a great master is not an easy thing to do. So what I wanted to do in my time is to talk a little bit about Shavuot and to ask really 2 questions. And the 2 questions are, what is it that we celebrate on this festival? Mm-hmm. And what does this celebration tell us about who we are as Jews? And that second question I'm going to come to at the very end. So Tammy gave you a lot of really good and important information. what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to go over some of the same material about Shavuot, but at the same time kind of take a couple steps back and maybe look at a slightly larger framework. So Shavuot, what is it that we celebrate, and who are we in this celebration? Let me go ahead and get this. Here we go. All right. So as we all know, there are many Jewish festivals throughout the year, and we celebrate many, if not most, perhaps even all of them. Right? There's Passover, which is probably the most widely celebrated Jewish festival, certainly in the United States, but also Hanukkah and Purim. And in the biblical period, in ancient Israel, as Tammy already mentioned, Shavuot was a major festival. In fact, it was one of the 3 most important festivals in the calendar. It was one of the pilgrimage festivals, along with Passover and Sukkot. And so according to Exodus, 3 times a year, at least all men, we're not really sure what the women did during these times, but the men were to appear before the Lord God, the God of Israel. Right? They were to pack their bags and travel to Jerusalem, present themselves at the temple, and present the offerings during these 3 festivals, including Shavuot. Since the destruction of the temple, I think it's fair to say, especially in comparison to other festivals like Passover and Hanukkah and Purim, that Shavuot doesn't really get the same amount of attention, right? It doesn't get the same love that some of the other festivals do. And I think one could spend some time trying to explain and understand why that is, right? Why is Shavuot of lesser importance for many Jews in their observance? I think one of the explanations could be that Shavuot, unlike Passover and Hanukkah and Purim, for instance, Shavuot doesn't conform to the standard narrative of Jewish history that we are all very familiar with. And that narrative is, they tried to kill us, we survived, let's eat. Right? Now, it's true, Shavuot has its own food. We all had our blintzes, our cheese platters earlier today. But it doesn't have that same resonance of danger, of persecution, of redemption, of salvation that some of the other festivals do. And maybe that explains a little bit why Shavuot is of perhaps lesser interest and importance for many Jews, particularly Jews in the United States. What I want to suggest, however, is that although Shavuot might be a lesser celebrated festival, in my thinking, Shavuot really is in many ways the most Jewish festival. Why do I think that? Well, hold on for a few minutes and I'll come to that at the end of my remarks. But before we get there, let me review a little bit of the information about Shavuot and the changes that have taken place in the celebration of the festival over Jewish history. So we start with Shavuot in the Bible. And Tammy has already talked about many of these biblical passages, but as we read in the Bible, Shavuot is identified primarily as an agricultural festival. So we're to observe the Feast of Weeks, Shavuot, that is the first fruits of the wheat harvest, and the Feast of Ingathering at the year's end. In addition, we are also told that these agricultural products are to be made as an offering to God. So on the first day of the first fruits, on Bikurim, when you offer a cereal offering of the new grain to the Lord at your feast, you shall have a holy convocation and you shall do no laborious work. Right? So it is to be a day of rest, and it is to be a day in which offerings are made to God. And then finally in Deuteronomy, you shall count the 7 weeks that the rabbi referred to in his remarks. Begin the counting from the time you first put the sickle to the standing of the grain, so that Shavuot really marks the end period of this agricultural harvest. And you shall keep the Feast of Weeks to the Lord your God with a tribute of a free will offering from your hand. So harvesting, making offerings of the grain of the first fruits, this is what the Bible speaks about when it talks about Shavuot. So Shavuot, our earliest celebration of Shavuot is connected to the land. right? It's an agricultural celebration in which the Israelites are commanded to make offerings of grain and first fruits. And it is a festival that is connected primarily, if not exclusively, to the land itself. It is a festival that celebrates the land and the produce that is grown from that land. And in connection with the land, it is also a celebration that takes place in connection with the temple. So these are some of the themes, and the ways in which Shavuot was celebrated in ancient Israel. What happens when we come to the rabbis? Well, when we come to the rabbis, we find, as Tammy has already mentioned, a very, very different take on this festival. So in one passage, when the rabbis are trying to figure out exactly when was Torah given that in the Bible itself, in Exodus 19, it really doesn't give a specific date when that took place. So the rabbis, being rabbis, they want an answer. They want to know when did Moses receive Torah on Sinai? So why was the Torah given during Sivan and not in Nisan or during any other of the other months, right? So the rabbis know, based on a certain interpretation of a passage from Exodus 19, that the giving of the Torah took place in the month of Sivan. So for the rabbis, already there is a deep connection between the month of Sivan, the month that we are currently in, the month when Shavuot takes place, a deep connection between the month of Sivan and the giving of Torah. But the rabbis, as was the case with many other festivals, including Passover, the rabbis face a dilemma after the year 70 CE, when the temple is destroyed by the Romans. So the rabbis, in interpreting this passage from Deuteronomy that I've already referred to, right, that you should observe the Feast of Weeks, you should observe Shavuot, right? That's the commandment in Deuteronomy, observe Shavuot. So what do? As has already been said, the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of First Fruits, that's how you used to celebrate Shavuot. But what happens when there is no temple? What happens when maybe you're not even present in the land? Right? As I already mentioned, Shavuot in its biblical understanding is intimately and explicitly connected to the land. So what happens when you're not in the land? Does that mean you don't celebrate Shavuot? And of course, the rabbis will say, absolutely not. But what does the celebration of Shavuot look like when there is no temple, or even when you are living apart from the land? You should not think that if there's no harvest, you need not observe the festival, right? Don't think that just because the temple's gone, that just because you're not living in the land of Israel, don't think that you shouldn't observe Shavuot. It is said that you shall observe the Feast of Weeks. For example, when Israel is in the diaspora and has no barley sheaf to harvest, even then you should celebrate Shavuot. Okay, in that particular tradition, it doesn't exactly explain why you should celebrate Shavuot or what Shavuot celebrates, but it does say that even in a diaspora context, the festival of Shavuot remains a commandment. So what does the festival of Shavuot commemorate or celebrate for the rabbis? Well, as Tammy has already mentioned, for the rabbis, the festival of Shavuot becomes not an agricultural festival, but a festival that celebrates the giving of Torah. So Mar, the son of Rabina, would fast the whole year, except on certain occasions. The Feast of Weeks, that is Shavuot, on Purim, and on the Day of Atonement. Why does he fast on the Feast of Weeks? Because it is the day on which Torah was given. And there you have it. Right? For the rabbis, Shavuot is not an agricultural festival. It's not connected to the temple. It's not connected to the land, but it is connected to the giving of Torah. So for the rabbis, Shavuot is all about Torah. It is a celebration of the giving of the Torah, which means that just as the Torah is the portable divine presence, let's call it, just as the Torah contains the words of the living God, and therefore is the portable vehicle through which the divine presence can be experienced. Therefore, Shavuot can be celebrated anywhere. You do not need a temple. You do not need to be present in the land You do not need to participate in an agricultural ritual. You have the Torah, and the Torah can be found anywhere. Okay. Fast forward then to the late 19th, early 20th century, and we come to the connection between Shavuot and Zionism. And one of the things that many early Zionists do is to return to the understanding of Shavuot as an agricultural festival and as a festival connected to the, as an agricultural festival and connected to the land itself. And turn to Shavuot as a major commemoration about the connection between the Jewish people and the land of Israel. So here's a brief excerpt from a speech that Menachem Ushishkin, who was then the president of the Jewish National Fund, the JNF, right? The organization that we know that plants all those trees in Israel, right? You know, you can go visit your tree at some point. But the Jewish National Fund before 1948 was much more than about just, you know, planting trees. The original purpose of the Jewish National Fund was to purchase land, right? To purchase land on which new Jewish agricultural communities, such as a kibbutz, could be built. And this is what Ushishkin says in the 1930s, and how he essentially reinterprets the celebration of Shavuot to reconnect this festival, to reconnect the Jewish people to the land through this festival. So this is what Ushishkin says. You children, and this was a speech that he delivered at a Shavuot festival in the city of Haifa. You children of Israel have brought the fruits of your soil, the fruits of your toil, to the supreme body for the redemption of the land of our fathers. Our forefathers 2,000 years ago also brought forth the first fruits of Shavuot, but then they brought the first fruits not to Haifa, the city of the future, but to Jerusalem, the eternal city, not to Mount Carmel, but to Mount Moriah, that is, to the city of Jerusalem. And they gave their first fruits not to the Jewish National Fund, but to the Holy Temple, right? And you know, in typical Ushishkin language, right? This is quite a chutzpahdik statement, right? That the Jewish National Fund is now the new priesthood, right? You don't bring your offerings to the priests in the temple, you bring it to the JNF. Nevertheless, I have consented to accept from you your first fruits, right? In the form which you have brought them today for this reason. The same form was customary in the period when our people lived as a free nation in its own homeland. Our times today are not the same as in that period to which we aspire, which we hope to attain, for which we long. Our redemption is still not the complete redemption, but we live in the beginning of the redemption, right? This kind of messianic understanding of the Zionist movement. The Messiah is still not come. There are only the agonies of the Messiah. Therefore, the form of renewal of our lives and the bringing of the first fruits is still not complete. It accords with this period. It is only the beginning of the ancient form, which will be complete when the redemption is complete. Let us not forget, the national chain of the people begins with the festival which we are celebrating today. That is, this festival marks really the beginning of the Jewish people as a people. This was not only a festival of nature, right? There's that agricultural understanding, the festival of first fruits, of soil and toil. This is the day of the giving of Torah. But notice how Ushishkin reinterprets this concept of the giving of Torah. This is the day of the giving of Torah. And on that day, we became a nation. It's a fabulous way of thinking about Shavuot, that the giving of Torah is not about the 613 commandments, right? It's not about trying to, determine what it is that you're supposed to do, what it is that you're prohibited from doing, right? It's about becoming a people, becoming a nation, which was central to the Zionist understanding of its aspirations. We cannot separate these two festivals. That is the festival that connects Jews to the land and the festival that creates Jews as a people are connected, right? That the people and the land are joined together through this festival. In one day, we were created a nation. That is on the day when Torah was given, we were created a nation and became a people. tilling the land, right? That is who this people is, right? The Jewish people are a people who work the land, who are thereby connected to that land. And one day we were created a nation, became a people tilling the land with the sweat of its brow. So Shavuot in Israel, it is a celebration of agricultural settlements. It reconnects Shavuot with the land. Right? That was in the Zionist thinking of Shavuot. Shavuot reconnects the Jewish people as a people, right, to the land. And also it redefines the significance of what the Torah is, right? The Torah for Zionists is not a set of 613 commandments. It's not it's not this litany of do's and don'ts, right? It is the constitution of the Jewish people. It is the moment at which the Jewish people were formed as a nation. And it is a nation that is connected to the land. And it is these understandings that really become the foundation of much of Zionist thinking. So Shavuot connects Jews to the land and to the nation. Okay, finally, I want to come back to that question that I began with, and that is, what does the celebration of Shavuot say about us, and why is it that I said that to me, Shavuot is kind of, is kind of the most Jewish festival. And to me, it's the most Jewish festival because Shavuot asks one of the most fundamental questions in modern Jewish history. And that is, who are the Jewish people? Are Jews a people of the book, a people of Torah? Or are the Jewish people a people of the land? So when we celebrate Shavuot, are we a diasporous people, a people who can live anywhere because the Torah is transportable and can be read and studied anywhere we happen to live? And in that sense, Shavuot is connected to the rabbinic understanding of the festival, that is in the giving of Torah. So that's one way that the Jewish people have kind of defined themselves, particularly throughout their history, but particularly in the modern world. But alternatively, if we're not a diasporous people, perhaps we might think of ourselves as a Zionist people who are directly and intimately connected to the land as a people. So who are we? Are the Jewish people a people as Shavuot was understood in the biblical period, a people connected to the land and a Zionist wanted to reclaim? Or are the Jewish people a people of the book, a people who are a light to the nations and take their understanding of Torah and their ethical principles to the far corners of the world? I would end then with perhaps another way of looking at Shavuot, and another way of looking at what Shavuot means for who Jews are as a people. And this is the way that I think Shavuot reminds us that the Torah and the land are connected, intimately connected. And that this idea of are Jews a people of the book or a people of the land, maybe it's a bit of both. And I begin this understanding going back to the book of Deuteronomy, to a very famous passage from the latter chapters of the book of Deuteronomy, which makes this connection. So if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, right? That's the giving of Torah, right? If you obey the commandments by loving the Lord your God, walking in his ways, keeping his commandments, his statutes and ordinances, then you shall live and multiply. And the Lord God will bless you in the land. Right? The possession of the land is conditioned upon the observance of the commandments. It is not absolute. It is only possible if the people of Israel are obedient to God, obedient to God's commands, to the statutes and the ordinances. And so I go back to, so what are some of those statutes and ordinances? What are some of those 613 commandments that Tammy referred to? And I would just mention one here, and that is the connection of the land must be informed by Torah. So how does Torah inform our understanding of the land? And here I come to what to me is a central precept, a central commandment from the book of Deuteronomy. And that is justice, justice, tzedek, tzedek, shall you pursue. Tzedek, tzedek, tirdof. Justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may live and inherit the land. So Israel's possession of the land, Israel as a people of the land, can only exist, can only be possible if Israel is also a people of the book, if Israel is a people of justice. And without justice, there is no possession of the land. And so in some ways, Shavuot reminds us of perhaps one of the most fundamental principles in Judaism, and that is the principle of justice, because it is only through justice that we can achieve the goal of inheriting the land. So with that, I will stop.
Thank you, Gary. Opening it up, if there are people who have comments or questions for Gary. Tammy's applauding, but I'm looking at.
No. She's just waving me away. Looks like applause. It's not really.
All right. Any thoughts, comments about? Yeah, Mikey, go ahead.
Well, I'm thinking that perhaps we might be putting too much emphasis on the land now. And the reason I say that is, way back in Genesis, the covenant was to a land that I will show you. Okay, so, the first exile and we should have been over. But we weren't. So in that sense, I think I'm more persuaded by the transportability than I am with a piece of land.
And that position has been a widely held and a very widely held position amongst Jews throughout their history and even today. Right? And in fact, one could point out that one of the peculiarities about Torah, right? And by Torah here, I'm talking about the 5 books of the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, right? The Sefer Torah. Right? One of the peculiarities about the Sefer Torah is that there are all these promises about land, but Israel never makes it into the land in Torah, right? Israel only makes it to the land after Torah. So there is no possession of the land in Torah. I mean, except for the cave of Machpelah, maybe. But, other than those few little things, there is no possession of the land in Torah. Right? And, and one of the other fascinating things about the giving of the law, of course, and this was well known to the rabbis and often commented on by them, is the fact that the giving of Torah was made outside the land. Okay? And the rabbis have to explain. So if the land is so important, why was Torah given outside the land? Why wasn't it given inside the land? And so I think that these two concepts, this diasporous concept and this Zionist landist concept, whatever you want to call it, have been two features, two perspectives, two ways of thinking about who Jews are and what Judaism is. And clearly the focus on Torah and its portability has been a major way that Jews have lived their lives. Absolutely.
Other comments or questions? Deborah, go ahead.
Okay, so I tuned in late, but
Don't worry, there's no quiz.
I have to say, from an educator's point of view with young children, Shavuot has always been the best holiday because we're not talking about having to deal with Antiochus or no, seriously. All the other holidays with young children, it's about conflict, it's about war, it's about destruction, it's negativity that we're trying to teach. We're trying to clean a moral for the children. But with Shavuot, it's talking about guidelines. It's very positive. It's about how do we live together? Like Gary, you said, justice, shall we pursue? Well, that's it. It's how do we live together? These are the rules that we need to try to remember, to follow. So always thought Shavuot has never had enough credit because it's really the best for children, for sharing their religion.
Yeah, and as one of the pictures I think that I showed in my presentation indicated, that it's very true in Israel as well, right? That in Israel, it is a time for children to kind of get dressed up and to bring all kinds of fruits and vegetables and to present them and make an offering at their schools. And yeah, and it really is, other than the TIKKUN LEIL Shavuot, other than the midnight study sessions, right, which have become very popular, it is a celebration that is focused on children. And I think for all the reasons that you just suggested. So thank you.
And of course, Deborah's also used it as a good opportunity to, focus on, honoring parents throughout. And we don't have to deal with the challenges of Mother's Day and Father's Day. Not all the kids have moms, not all the kids have dads, not all the kids have whatever, but we don't do those holidays specifically in the preschool, but we've done, something around honoring your parents with the Ten Commandments at Shavuot. So we've had that as an opportunity throughout those years. Anybody else, even people without their cameras on, anybody else have any questions or comments here before we move to the next piece? All right. Well, thank you so much, Gary, for that. And I'm going to turn it back to you, Paul.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Gary. Thank you, Tammy. I thought with a little bit of focus on the agricultural aspects of Eretz Yisrael, we could do something a little different. Here's a really cool rendition of the chant Eretz Zavat Chalav Udvash, that it is a land flowing with milk and honey. And here's Her Highness Nina Simone. From 1962, Nina Simone and an incredible trio and an incredible Toph player. I wish I could share the name with you, but I can't at the moment. Rabbi.
Yeah. So I'm just going to take a few minutes because I want to actually try to get us out of here by about 9 o'clock, which is only 12 minutes away. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to share a few thoughts. I love to look at different midrashim around Revelation at the mountain and kind of play with them a little bit as to why those midrashim were being written. Why did the rabbis choose to put these spins on the text and what's going on there, right? So on the Peshat level, the simple level, what is revealed out loud at Mount Sinai to the people is the 10 Commandments, right? We have the 10 Commandments that are given to the whole people, and then the Torah itself given through Moses, right, to the people. And then, as Tammy said, there are, I think in the Zohar, it was talking about, well, it was just the first 2 commandments that were given. That's how you got from 611 to 613. And there are even in places that it says, no, actually only the first word, Anochi, what's all the people heard, was the first word, I am, right? And then there's even a comment that says that all that's revealed is the first letter to the whole people, right? And of course, the first letter is an Aleph, so it's a little, it's an interesting piece, especially because it's a silent letter, right? We have this silent letter Aleph that is revealed. But I think the question is, at some level, what is it that we actually have to hear in order to have the revelation there? Is it some kind of an experience that we share together? Is it the particular words that are heard? Jewish tradition, and we read this in Nitzavim, says that all Jewish souls, past, present, and future, stood at Mount Sinai. And so I think there's an interesting piece here about what did we hear and how did that play out? And of course, when we hear it, whether it was we heard all the 10 Commandments, whether it was we heard the first 2, whether it was we heard Anochi, that first word, I am, and all we need to know is God is, right? And we said, according to tradition, Na'aseh v'nishma, we will hearken, we will do, and we will hearken, right? We will. So we have this idea of, we say, yes, we will do it. We will jump in, and we will even perhaps before we understand it, right? So we have this sense of Na'aseh v'nishma as we move in. And there's another set of midrashim here that I think are interesting, and that is, okay, so how are the people? Are the people that all sounds like we're really just very, I'm trying to think of the best word. We're very enthusiastic about accepting Torah, right? That's one way to understand it, right? God is just barely opening God's mouth, and we're like, yes, we're going to do this. But there are counter stories within the tradition as well. There's a story that shows up in Midrashim and in the Talmud. It's probably shows up in a slightly different form, because in the biblical text, it says that the people gathered tachat har at the it's translated as usually at the base of the mountain, but the rabbis play with that and say, well, it means that they were under the mountain, right? So one understanding is that, no, God lifts the mountain and holds it over the people, right? And then says, hey, will you accept my Torah? And sort of like, if you don't accept my Torah, I'm dropping the mountain on you, right? And you're not going to be long here. And then the people say, yeah, Na'aseh v'nishma, right? Kind of shifts that understanding a little bit from one of just enthusiastic, yes, to, yeah, we'll take it. The alternative isn't good, so we'll do it. Okay. And then there's a third comment, which is, I think, a really fascinating one, and takes that same image and turns it into a beautiful one, which says, yes, God did lift up the mountain over the people, but it's lifted up like a chuppah, like a wedding canopy, that is over the people as they enter into covenant, right, with God. So and I just want to play with those images. We won't solve them now because we're going to end in a moment, but leave you with a few questions. One is, in which parts or at what times do we just enthusiastically embrace those parts of our tradition, or our place in it as Jews, or our connection to the land? What are those places that we don't need a whole lot of processing? It's who I am, right? It's what I do. Are there places that maybe we do things because, I've got to do it, right? Maybe with a little less joy and a little less enthusiasm, we feel there's a mountain over our head. I don't have a choice, right? It's what I need to do as a Jew, right? I have to, the old phrase, it's hard to be a Jew, right? So how does that play out in various ways? And what times does Judaism or certain pieces that we commit ourselves to feel like a burden, but we feel like we have to do it, right? And then the third place is, in which ways when we enter into these aspects of our tradition, because that's what Shavuot is really all about. It's about re-entering the covenant, whatever that covenant means to you, right? In which ways do we do that and really find ourselves entering into holiness, right? Standing under a chuppah, entering into a holy space and creating that for ourselves. And how do those various things play for us, right, in our life? I know that when I sit at a Beit Din that is welcoming new Jews into the Jewish people, often a question that will be asked is, what is, one of the things that you like most about that you've learned about Judaism? And also, what are some of the things that you've learned that perhaps you don't like a whole lot, right? Because within our tradition are those things that lift our spirits and raise us up, and also perhaps things that we don't embrace. And yet they're all part of our Yerusha, they're part of our tradition, they're still part of what we inherit. Now we have to kind of figure out what we do with them, right? How do we move those out of the way? How do we reinterpret those things to be things that work better for us? So we stand, each of us, however you see it, at the mountain on this Shavuot, hearing whatever we hear, those commandments, that utterance, that sense that we're all there together, and standing at the base of that mountain, or perhaps under it, as we renew ourselves for another year, and see ourselves, perhaps to echo Gary, we are kind of not only reconnecting ourselves to mitzvot, but kind of recommitting ourselves to what it means to be part of the Jewish people at this time. So we're going to move toward our conclusion. We have a couple final rituals. I'm going to turn it back to Paul so that we can close up.
So we wanted to conclude our time together, or at least move to conclude our time together in a traditional way with a traditional festival kiddush. So I know that many of you may not have wine and bread available, but I do. So here's our festival kiddush. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bachar banu mikol am v'romemanu mikol lashon v'kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'titen lanu Adonai Eloheinu be'ahava moadim lesimcha chagim uzmanim lesason. Et Yom Hag HaShavuot Hazeh Zman Matan Toratenu Mikra Kodesh Zechel Etziat Mitzrayim Kivanu Vacharta Veotanu Kidashta Mikol Ha'amim Umoadei Kodshecha Besimcha Uvsason Hinchaltanu. Baruch atah Adonai Mekadesh Yisrael v'hazmanim. L'chaim. And what would Kiddush be without a little motzi? So reach your virtual hands out and touch the challah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lechem min haaretz chag sameach.
Oh, are you going to play us out with a video?
I will.
Okay.
Let me swallow first. So I know that most of all of our hearts are turned not only for religious or spiritual or historical reasons, but for real reasons of concern for our friends, for our family, for all of the residents of Israel and Palestine as they experience an incredible communal disintegration in the kind of human relations that have sustained the two peoples living side by side, as well as how the conflict between Hamas and the state of Israel has intensified over recent days. So I thought I would share as a closer for this evening our prayer for the state of Israel. We hear it verbally read in our synagogue on many occasions, but this version that I've chosen is Meir Finkelstein's musical version of the prayer for the state of Israel, sung by my colleague, my friend, Cantor Rachel Goldman from Congregation Ner Tamid in Rancho Palos Verdes, although this was recorded quite a number of years ago now, when she worked, as I did when I was a student, at Beit Shuvah in Los Angeles. So with that, I will share the video, and we wish you Lehitraot, Chag Sameach, and just a reminder that we will be gathering tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. On Zoom on this same link for our Shavuot morning service, and more a little more tefillah, hopefully a little more study and conversation as well.
And thank you again to doctors, our teachers today, Dr. Schneider and Gilbert. Could be sounds like a firm, but thank you.
I like to think of it as Schnilbert.
Thank you so much for teaching us this evening. Chag Shavuot Sameach. Look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.